In 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated. Caesar had just won a years-long civil war to become dictator of Rome, and with his death, the whole thing basically started over again. In what became known as the Liberators' Civil War, Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, fled to the east to start their own government, only to be crushed by Octavian and Antony at Philippi. In the wake of the battle, a general named Quintus Labienus, the son of Caesar's most stalwart opponent, fled into Parthia and convinced them to invade the undefended east in 41. You may recall from the last episode that Antipater, the pro-Roman regent of Judea, had actually given in to the demands of Caesar's assassins, to his ultimate doom. This effectively left his son Herod as the military ruler of Judea, with extra legitimacy points through his engagement to Princess Mariamne, the heir to the Judean throne. So when the Parthians invaded Judea, nobody really knew who would side with whom. King Hyrcanus II had been reduced to a Roman puppet, and Herod's loyalties were a mystery. To pressure Herod further, the Parthians took his brother Faisal as a hostage. For some extra background, Herod had long served as military governor of Roman-occupied Galilee, going back to when he was just a teenager, and had already developed a reputation as a petty tyrant and war criminal. In his early 20s, Herod had nearly received a death sentence from the Great Sanhedrin for summarily executing a band of robbers, only to receive a deeply unpopular royal pardon under pressure from his father. Herod had even been previously married with a son, but was pressured by his father into divorcing and banishing his young family in order to secure a permanent alliance between his family and the Hasmoneans. Nevertheless, he remained a pariah among both the Jewish elite and the general public. Unbeknownst to the Parthians, Herod was extremely popular with the person who mattered most, Mark Antony. Throughout the earlier war between Caesar and Pompey, Antony had been Caesar's most loyal confidant, and was very popular in the eastern Mediterranean. By plying Antony with lavish gifts courtesy of the Judean treasury, Herod believed that Antony would be as favorable towards Judea as he had been towards Cleopatra's Egypt. So while the Parthians debated the proper course of action long past dusk, Herod and Mariamne disappeared from the city, vowing to honor Judea's alliance with Rome. With them out of the picture entirely, the Parthians deposed Hyrcanus and crowned his nephew as King Antigonus. For Herod and Mariamne, sailing directly to Rome was impossible. Herod's unpopularity meant that anyone who recognized him on the road to Jaffa might be inclined to take vengeance. Instead, Herod headed southeast, skirmishing his way down the shores of the Dead Sea until reaching the old Idumean fortress of Masada. Having learned of his brother's escape, Faisal committed suicide in prison so as to deprive Parthia the satisfaction of killing him. After reconnoitering with some of his father's old advisors, Herod decided to make for Nabatea, the ancestral home of his mother, and seek assistance from King Malik I. However, Nabatea was also under Parthian occupation, and Malik urged Herod to leave. Finally, Herod and Mariamne fled to the court of Cleopatra, where the couple found themselves in the opposite situation. Whereas Herod wanted to get to Rome as quickly as possible, Cleopatra urged him to stay in Alexandria. It was winter, the most dangerous time for a Mediterranean crossing. Furthermore, Sextus Pompey, the son of Caesar's old rival, had taken over Sicily and was using it as a base to attack ports in Italy and Greece. And as a final bonus, Rome itself was in chaos as Antony's wife and brother attempted to seize power. Undeterred, Herod took his chances. He and Mariamne boarded a ship for Pamphylia, and sure enough, were all but shipwrecked and stranded on the island of Rhodes. There, Herod met up with a couple of acquaintances from Antony's inner circle who brought him the latest news. First, it was just as well that he hadn't landed in Pamphylia because the Parthians had already occupied it, along with almost all of Asia Minor. Second, Antony's wife Fulvia had died, ending the unrest in Italy. And third, the Roman navy had gained the upper hand against Sextus Pompey, reopening the seas for safe travel. Herod then informed them of what the Parthians had done in Judea, which his associates quickly relayed to Antony, and before long, Herod and Mariamne were in Italy. Mariamne was a Hasmonean on both sides, the granddaughter of the rival kings Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. Her very conception had been engineered to heal the rift between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and it was hoped that she would one day be as great a ruler as her great-grandmother Alexandra. Although she was only 14, Mariamne entered the Roman Senate with her head held high, ready to become a queen. The mood in the Senate chamber was very different. Having heard of Antigonus's treachery, and recalling Antipater's devotion to Caesar, Antony and Octavian rallied the Senate around Antipater's son. That same afternoon, the two men brought Herod into the Via Sacra and crowned him King of the Jews. They had been in Italy just 7 days. By the beginning of 37 BCE, the Romans had gained the upper hand in the east. Antony had recaptured most of Asia Minor, and given the Parthians a crushing blow near the border between Syria and Judea. Abandoned by the Parthians and encircled by Rome, Antigonus was ready to be taken down. Herod landed at Ptolemais, modern-day Acre, with 15,000 Roman auxiliaries and a few Italian Jewish volunteers, occupying the Galilee with almost no resistance. He then raced down the Sharon plain and captured Joppa before turning south to relieve Masada, where most of his family had stayed behind under siege. He then pushed into the mountains, marrying Princess Mariamne in the snows of Samaria. Finally, in early spring, Herod's forces arrived outside Jerusalem, where 6,000 Roman cavalry under Gaius Sosius were already waiting. Herod was surprised to discover that the Parthians had apparently begun construction of an entirely new section of the city, but had no trouble breaching its unfinished walls. 15 days later, Herod entered through the Baris and quickly captured the lower city and the Acra. Antigonus's forces were actually shorter on food than usual, because it was the end of the Shemitah cycle, but the upper city and Temple Mount held out for another 40 days, presenting a challenge to any civilian in the upper city who wished to make a sacrifice at the temple, and Antigonus ended up using this to his advantage. Herod was not Jewish by ancestry. His mother was an Arab noblewoman, and his father was the child of Edomite converts. Antigonus thus encouraged rumors that this half-Jew was secretly an idolater. He had, after all, been crowned in the Via Sacra, and that he had brought a Roman army specifically to defile the temple. Clearly, this really got under Herod's skin, because he immediately relented, allowing free movement between the occupation zones to facilitate temple sacrifices. Finally capturing the Temple Mount on Yom Kippur, Herod bribed Sosius not to let his men go in and desecrate it, though he was frustratingly unable to stop them from looting the rest of the city. Because of this, Herod sent the troops away along with a strongly worded letter of condemnation to Antony, along with a nice bribe for Antony to kill Antigonus before he could reach Rome, lest the crowds at his triumph take a liking the same way they had with Cleopatra's sister Arsinoe a decade earlier. Herod spent the next year rebuilding Jerusalem to be virtually unassailable. The Baris had never been an effective defense against the high ground north of the city, so Herod replaced it with the much larger Antonia fortress, named after Antony, along with another citadel guarding the Jaffa Gate, and next to that a huge new royal palace, rivaled in size only by the temple itself. The second defensive wall was completed around the northern Tyropian Valley, which nearly doubled the city's population capacity. The high priest also got his own palace, and Jerusalem finally got a hippodrome. So far so good, right? But much like his father, Herod suffered from clinical depression that often manifested as fits of paranoia. Herod had already become notorious as a war criminal. Now he was a usurper, and upon his return to Judea, his worst instincts really kicked into high gear. The same year that Jerusalem was rebuilt, Herod commissioned a massive expansion of the fortress at Masada, where he had first escaped during the Parthian War. But this was no ordinary castle. Whereas Herod's massive overhaul of Jerusalem was completed in a year, Masada took 6 years. The finished product was a massive villa with running water, Roman-style baths, 2 pleasure palaces, and an 18-month supply of food and wine. There was no pretense here. Herod built a fortress to defend himself against his own subjects, and while he never ended up using it, Masada's construction did end up as something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. By overtaxing the citizenry to build what was essentially a monument to his contempt for them, Herod ensured that he would never win them over. Mariamne was well aware of Herod's ills, and to stop him from becoming too powerful, insisted that Herod nominate her brother Aristobulus for high priest. Aristobulus was only 17 years old, and the high priesthood had a minimum age requirement of 20, so this wasn't strictly legal. But it was a necessary precaution to maintain Hasmonean hegemony, and Herod was in no position to argue. Aristobulus was confirmed as high priest soon after Herod and Mariamne returned to Jerusalem, only to drown less than a year later under mysterious circumstances. Mariamne's mother, Princess Alexandra, believed, probably correctly, that Herod had ordered the killing, and secretly wrote to Cleopatra demanding that Mark Antony try the king. Fearing that he would be found guilty, Herod sent Mariamne away to the home of his uncle Joseph. Herod worried that Mariamne would remarry after his death, and rather than allow that to happen, ordered his uncle to murder Mariamne so she would never have been with another man. But Joseph could do no such thing, and told Mariamne everything, for which he would later be executed. Having convinced Antony of his loyalty, if not his innocence, Herod returned to Judea, even defeating Nabatea and ruling it as governor. But another challenge to his rule came quickly. In 31 BCE, Rome fell once again into civil war, and Antony suffered a pivotal defeat at the Battle of Actium. Within a year, Antony and Cleopatra would both be dead, and the Roman civil wars would finally be over. A few weeks later, Herod met Octavian at Rhodes and convinced the future Augustus that Judea would remain loyal to the Republic, or rather empire. But it was clear that Herod would never be free of his paranoia. No number of enemies vanquished would enable him to sleep easily, and in 29 BCE, he turned his terror against Mariamne. Herod became convinced that Mariamne was having an affair, and that she planned to poison him. Eventually, Herod had Mariamne tried for treason by the Great Sanhedrin, and they probably would have acquitted her, but for a quirk in the Judean legal system. While the leader of the majority party served as Nasi, or president of the Great Sanhedrin, the leader of the minority usually served as Av Bet Din, or chief justice in criminal trials. And the current Av Bet Din was a man named Menachem the Essene. Despite the nominally austere traditions of his sect, Menachem lived a lavish and corrupt lifestyle, dressing head to toe in silk, and even specializing in divination. When Herod was just a boy in school, Menachem addressed him on the street as king, despite him not being a part of the royal family. Herod asked, "How long will I reign? 10 years? Menachem replied, "You will be king for at least 30. Menachem was a devout loyalist to Herod, and almost certainly threatened the families of enough members of the Sanhedrin to vote in favor of Mariamne's conviction. The sentence was death. Mariamne, Queen of Judea, was 25 years old. Princess Alexandra, declaring that Herod was unfit to rule, declared herself queen, but was tried and executed soon after. 9 years after Mariamne's execution, Menachem the Essene quit the Sanhedrin to work in Herod's cabinet. With his departure, the Pharisees effectively restored one-party rule. Their leader, Rabbi Hillel the Elder, would not allow such injustice in his court again. Special thanks to my patrons, including Gaonete level patron Vicky Nelson. If you like this video, you can also donate via Patreon link below. You can also check out my book, An Armada of Cats Travels in Israel, along with links to my sources for this video. Otherwise, you can always like, share, and subscribe. I will see you next time.